Uju wago shindigu minawa migizi indodem, kazaga squaji mekag indunjiba. Today I'd like to share a little bit about the topic of historical trauma. And as I do, I want to thank my colleague Linsey McMurrin, who furnished a couple of the slides that I'll be sharing with you. Miigwech? And I'd mentioned by way of analogy that, there are two dimensions to our genetic underpinnings. So one is there's something that is kind of hardwired in our genetic code. And those are things like we have a fight, flight, freeze response when there's something that threatens us, right? That part is hardwired. And if humans didn't have that, we would all be hit by cars. But in addition to that, there's kind of an overlayment on top of our core genetic carriage that is deeply impacted by recent experiences. And that code can be passed on through the generations. So you're seeing some good definitions and comments popping up now in the chat here. People receive feelings from the past, trauma that follows throughout multiple generations, that it's generational and shared by a group, things that happened in the past that continue to affect people now. So a lot of you have a pretty good understanding of the basic ideas here. Trauma passed down from one generation to another. So this is all really good. Thinking of the past, feeling stuck. All right. Yeah, neglecting so-called marginalized views and groups. Multi-generational trauma experienced by a certain particular group. Yeah, so all of that context is really helpful. So, I mentioned like the monarch butterflies who go on a 3,000-mile epic journey with multiple stops and multiple metamorphoses, and the knowledge of where to go, where to stop, when and how to morph, like no one has to teach them that. It's built into the genetic code, right? And so it's the same thing with sea turtles that when they're born know to go out to sea, not to go upland. These sort of things are built into the genetic code. And then here is a little reference to, if you're interested in kind of the science start of some articles on epigenetics and things like that. These articles at the bottom of the slide here can kind of help you. But what we're finding out now is that the experiences that we have in life get passed on through generations. So, it's not just the case that we are only impacted by our environment. Is it our nurture or our nature? But there's something kind of in between where something environmental impacts our genetic code and then gets implanted as an overlayment on our core genetic code, and our children and grandchildren will receive that. So, for example, all of us as human beings have someone in our family tree that has experienced some sort of trauma. Like all of us had somebody clunking somebody over the head with a club, if you go far enough back in time. So all of us could have an impact from historical trauma. We could have it show up like self-destructive behavior, substance abuse, unexplained depression that might feel like it comes out of nowhere. That can happen to any of us. But one of the things that happens when you look at some groups of people, like, Native Americans, for example, who had very intense periods of very painful trauma, like genocide, residential boarding schools, schools that kept cemeteries for kids, some that kept mass graves, these sort of things really impacted people. So instead of popping up today, it might pop up like popcorn. Do, 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 do. So that's one of the dimensions of, historical trauma and the epigenetic imprint. And one of the things that kind of makes it tough to navigate in a school, for example, is our training says, here are the standards. Here's what a good lesson plan looks like. Stick to the script and get those kids ready for the test. But if someone is dealing with lots of contemporary trauma or historical trauma, there might be things that are making it really difficult for them. And if we aren't able to make and hold space to understand that, or to act on it in healthy, positive, and constructive ways, then it can be very isolating and lonely for those who are dealing with it. And we can become kind of calcified or like just upset. So for example, there might be, because so many people in the parent and especially the grandparent generation went through residential boarding schools, there might be some people who just feel uncomfortable in a school the way that someone feels uncomfortable in a hospital who's had a negative experience there might feel. And we're sitting around like, well, it's parent-teacher conference time. Where are the parents? Don't they love their kids? How come they're not here? And we might not see or understand everything that might be driving that. So the Brene Brown quote here is kind of helpful for that. It's important to inculcate healthy empathy and to try to understand what's going on with the kids below the surface. So that means holding space for people, listening, withholding judgment, connecting on an emotional level. So like actually engaging in the feeling quadrant, not just thinking quadrant. And then communicating the healing message that, hey, you're not alone in dealing with this. It's also helpful just to look at the science of how this goes. So we're not just, how somebody feels, but you can really get some tools for understanding how this might function in the human brain. And so, if you look at the human brain, we have a core kind of lizard brain. You can think of like this, like if my thumb is our lizard brain, that's the fight, flight, freeze stuff. And then wrapped over the top of that with our prefrontal cortex, that's your wise owl, thinking about consequences and long-term stuff. And we all have both. But when there's a stress stimuli, someone feels threatened, then the wise owl goes offline and we're back to fight, flight, freeze. And we need to be able to do that, so that we can avoid, things that are going to get us killed. And so that's kind of how our brains are wired. And a little bit of stress is good. Occasional stresses like study, there's a test tomorrow. It's just a little bit to say, okay, I got to get back to business here. And it just kind of exercises that musculature, the mental musculature, so that we can deal with stuff. Like if kids have zero adversity and then we send them out into the world, they're going to run into adversity there and they'll be ill-equipped for it. So a little bit is good, but too much and too intense is the opposite. It's not good for us at all. So that's just a little bit on how the brain is wired. Here's the brain, model that I was just going through. Guard dog, fight, flight, freeze, wise owl. And then once we get a trauma or a drama, we flip our lid. And by the way, we flip our lid in many different ways. It could be, somebody throws something, boom, we react quickly and we catch it. Could be we swerve to avoid the deer or the moose. Could be other things too, boom, dopamine rush, I just fell in love and we forget about everything, But what can happen if we flip our lid many times, and what we're finding out now is that if someone has 5 adverse childhood experiences. That's enough. An adverse childhood experience could be, physical abuse, sexual abuse, the death of a loved one, any number of things. And if that happens enough, it starts to rewire our brains. So instead of, a little healthy workout and it's ready when we need it, what happens is it gets hypersensitized. And we either get hyper arousal, which is like agitated, anxious, quick to anger, difficult to deal with, prickly, right? Or we get so numbed out from it that you get zoned out, spaced out, disengaged as a coping mechanism. And so you might have, for example, students who have a lot of historical trauma. It doesn't even have to be traumas they've seen directly in their own lives, but things that happened to their grandma or something. And it might show up that the student is spaced out, zoned out, disengaged, and wants to hang out at the Native Advisor's office all the time instead of, mingling in mixed company at the lunchroom or whatever, or even in a regular class. It might show up that, they get a little cranky or agitated, or maybe their parents do, and everybody's stressed out over things like COVID and whatnot. So it could be any number of things. And so I mentioned this one that, brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels from time to time, these things can be positive. We can deal with something in the middle, like this could be, it's final exam time. All the teachers are throwing a lot of stuff at you, but if I buckle down and mom's getting me extra snacks and so forth, I can grind through that, and that's tolerable, and it won't last forever. But it can be toxic if there are prolonged periods of time when there's an activation of the stress response, or, especially if it's coupled with the absence of healthy supports to deal with that, it can be very tough. So imagine, for example, having your children taken away and sent to residential boarding schools, and you're sitting there all alone on the res and don't know where your kids are, if you're ever going to see them again. Or if you're a kid and you're taken to a school and now you don't have parents, community, family, even the language that you know around you, you got lots of harsh physical punishments, dangerous conditions because there's so much, tuberculosis and other things going on, not good nutrition, then you have big problems, and it actually causes true trauma. And so this just kind of gives you another way to look at how that might function for a person. So like if you look here at conception, on the bottom line there, we have our normal wiring for the human brain and body, and healthy adaptive mechanisms that naturally emerge from living in a safe world that provides minimal or tolerable levels of stress. And it develops the tools to be relationship oriented, to think things through, to develop healthy and adaptive approaches to solving problems. But if you have traumatic stress, it rewires the brain in a way where you might get edgy, hot-tempered, vigilant, or impulsive responses, and problems can balloon and not have a healthy response. And so the result is that the individuals who have had trauma experience or lots of trauma experience in the family tree, is that you have totally different and less healthy adaptive tools that might show up. And so here's where I mentioned hyperarousal or hypoarousal, and then there's a tolerance window in between. And so how somebody shows up, maybe it's a parent freaking out on you in an angry way. Maybe it's a kid who you just seems like won't engage. These might actually be normal biological adaptations to toxic stress and adversity. And they might not just be during somebody's lived experience. They might be things that were inherited through the family tree from the historical experience of that person or group of people. So when we look at, okay, Johnny's showing up with attitude today, and it's frustrating for me because I'm trying to run through a lesson plan, it might actually be the case that Johnny's not being willfully, disruptive, but is dealing with stuff. And if we see it that way, can detach a little bit from how it's impacting us, then we're better equipped to reach out with an empathic response and try to work on healthy adaptations and solutions. That doesn't mean Johnny can act any which way he wants. That does mean that we seek to understand what might be driving that and do that together with everyone in Johnny's circle, including Johnny and whoever is helping take care of him when he's out of school, and see if it's possible to work on a good plan that'll deal with it together. The epigenetic imprints, are profound. So, some of the studies have been things like putting a pain stimulus in the brain of a rat and interjecting this, a pain stimulus at the same time that a smell of apple blossoms is interjected. And that rat will be terrified of the smell of apple blossoms. But we now know that the children and grandchildren of that rat will be scared of that too. And so even today, you think about things like what happens for Native Americans, maybe who had relatives back in their family tree who endured a genocide affected by soldiers wearing blue uniforms with guns. And now we police them with people who wear blue uniforms and guns. That person might show up edgy, agitated, uncomfortable, distrustful, even if there's no, disrespectful or harmful behavior on the part of whoever's showing up that way, right? A police officer. I'm just going to go quick through this. I think you're pretty aware that there were lots of traumas, right? Disease epidemics, there was genocide. There was an assault on animals that Native people relied on for food. So this is just a pile of buffalo skulls. The US government orchestrated the killing of 60 million buffalo so that they could starve tribes into submission instead of fight them. And interestingly, if you look at the bottom of this quote, the Secretary of the Interior said, "We're doing this on purpose, not just to starve them into submission, but to force Native Americans to be dependent on us, the US government, for their food and well-being. And that this would be a good thing. We can subjugate them this way." And now when you flash forward to today, we're telling people, well, you should be independent. You should get a job, and things like that, but we're not necessarily putting it in a historical context and looking at all of the ways in which we rendered that so much more difficult. By the way, you all got to know me a little bit through the course of our earlier sessions. My father is a Holocaust survivor. Both of his parents and 2 cousins made it out. Everyone else in his family was killed in Nazi genocide. My mother is a survivor of genocide in a different way in an indigenous community. Her mother survived residential boarding schools and a pretty traumatic experience there, and it deeply affected her. And then here I am, and I inherited all of that, And you know what? It didn't totally ruin me. Like, I'm feeling pretty good today. I am healthy. I'm a productive, load-bearing citizen. We are not governed exclusively by the negative experiences in the trauma tree, but at the same time, that is something that does impact us. And for me, being aware of how that impacts me is helpful so that I can notice if, I am displaying, whatever, hyper arousal or hypoarousal in some circumstance. Oh, what's going on here? And I can develop my own situational awareness. And it's helpful for other people, who interact with me or with other Native people to understand how that functions, even though we shouldn't assume that, something bad happens means you're screwed for the rest of your life. That's not what that means. But a deep understanding of how this functions can help us navigate. All right. This is just kind of a common, famous image about manifest destiny. This was a definition of progress, and you can basically see the buffalo retreating, the natives retreating, the railroads, the stagecoaches, the white folk, democracy, the Bible are all advancing. And this was manifest destiny, the destiny of a nation to, go from one sea to the other. It didn't have to be this way, but this is how it played out. We also had the land issues, like most of the Oklahoma land rushes, for example, didn't just happen in land that was native land. They happened inside of Indian reservations. Like they found ways to get the land from the natives through a policy called allotment and just give it away for free to white folk inside the reservations. We saw this happen in the realm of mental health. Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians. They didn't even do like mental health assessments for their first few years of operations, but they did lobotomies. We saw this with an assault on treaty rights and harvest practices. We saw Native people prohibited from exercising their free religion. The US government couldn't keep up in building enough government-run boarding schools for all the natives, so they had to subcontract a lot of that work to churches. And so a lot of the schools were actually run by churches as well, which forced conversions to Christianity, even if that was not the religion of the kids who were sent to them. There were lists of Indian offenses, things natives couldn't do, and they included have dances, have powwows, things like that. There were many Native women who were sterilized by the US government through auspices of the Indian Health Service. So the only place that natives could go to get a vaccination against smallpox or whatever were the Indian health clinics. And those places also performed tubal ligations on Native women, often without consent and sometimes without even their knowledge. One of my mom's best friends had that experience. Got pregnant when she was 16, had to get a C-section. And this was a while back, so they were cutting up and down instead of a little crossways bikini cut. While they were in there, they performed a tubal ligation, even though she was a minor. She was 16 years old. And she didn't even find out that that had happened until she was 30, married, and wanted to try to have babies. They said, oh, you'll never have babies. And so those experiences, compound the trauma. This book by Tim Wise is really looking at data sets in the Black community, but it's a roundabout way to look at something happening in the Native community with regard to infant mortality. The Black and Indigenous infant mortality rates are actually pretty comparable to one another. And Tim Wise is looking at some studies that African immigrants who came to America actually had infant mortality rates that were pretty much on par with white Americans. But after they had stayed in America for a generation, the infant mortality rates for the next generation of Black Americans after immigration dropped to that of other African Americans. And there were only two possible explanations for that. So one was differential treatment within healthcare systems, and the other would be the physiological effects of living in a society that didn't treat them right. Looking at the Black data and seeing how it's on par with the Native data, even though Native people don't immigrate here, so you couldn't do the same kind of study, leads us to a suggestion, that experience is pretty comparable for the Native population. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, free Ojibwe language resources, resources for teachers, and more. Miigwech.